Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's episode. Tonight we're looking at how to control volume inside of the visual novel through a settings panel. Now I'm going to be setting this settings panel inside of my pause menu. You can set it wherever you would like. Once you have an appropriate space, we can begin. So choose the location that you're going to have your volume settings. This can be inside of your pause menu or inside of a separate one, but make sure that you'll be able to access it through a key press such as the P button or anything else that you want to use. Once you're ready to begin, we'll start by adding a slider, which is how we're going to control the volume. Inside of the UI, there's a value here, an object asset that's called a slider, and if we enter the scene view or the game view, you'll notice that we can just drag it and move it across and it changes this value number here. This will be the volume percentage that we'll be using. So take a moment to apply these, figure out what kind of volume you want to apply and control in the game. There could be things like music, voices, sound effects, ambience. Whatever you plan on controlling, make sure you have one slider for each of those and use a little text item next to it to give detail like what slider it is, some description to it, so that way the people playing your game know what it is they're affecting. For my setup, I've gone ahead and made 3 sliders for the music, sound effects, and voice. And now that we have those, we need to make some audio mixer groups for them to control. Whenever we create a sound, we want to assign an audio mixer to it, and that will allow us to control every sound using that mixer by altering variables on that mixer itself, such as the volume, the pitch, or whatever else you may want to use. So inside of the audio mixer panel, you can find this inside of the Windows, Audio, and Audio Mixer. The project has a default mixer called Master, and it's only one, but inside of that we can create subgroups by coming down to the groups and hitting this plus icon. That'll create a new group and we can name it something accordingly, like music. And for each one, we want to go through that and name them, and it'll automatically parent them to the master mixer. If you find that one has parented to another one, just simply click and drag it. So now we have all 3 mixers, but we need something to control. We can't actually affect the volume right now because there's no way to access it. The way we can get to that volume is by right-clicking the name over here in the inspector under attenuation for the volume and say expose the parameter. So we'll be exposing volume of the music mixer group to scripts, so we'll be able to access that from scripts. As soon as we do that, we'll have a little arrow icon saying that it's been exposed, and we can come down to exposed parameters here and see it right here. It says volume of music. If we just right-click and rename, then we can name it whatever we want. Once we have all 3 mixers and we have all 3 volumes, we're ready to start controlling them through our sliders. So let's go ahead and make a script so that way we'll be able to access all of this. I'm just going to make a script called Audio Mixer Controller because it's going to be responsible for handling the volumes. And inside, whenever we're going to be messing with audio, we need to be sure to include the Unity Engine audio namespace. So we'll say using Unity Engine.audio. And I'm also going to be using the UI, using Unity Engine.ui. And I'm also going to use TM Pro, so that way I can affect the text next to the audio sliders. So inside of here, the first thing we want, in order to be able to control the volumes, we need access to the master mixer, which has all the groups that we're going to be affecting. And this is simply an audio mixer. If we say public audio mixer and call it master mixer, then we'll have access to the mixer with all those exposed parameters. And I also want to reference the sliders that I have. So I'll say public slider, and I have one for the music, one for the sound effects, and one for the voices. I also have text to go with them, so I'll say. So now that we have our 3 sliders and our text, let's go ahead and make the function that's actually going to change the volume. We'll say public void set music volume. then public void. So when we want to change the values that we exposed earlier, there's a function here inside of the master mixer called setFloat. Mastermixer.setFloat, and it expects the name of the variable, which is what we named earlier, and the value to set it at. So for music, I named it music volume, and I'm going to set it to the music slider dot value. However, that's not going to work, and let me show you why. When we come inside of Unity and we head to our audio mixers, the slider has a value from 0 to 1 by default, the way I have it, because it's a percentage. 0 is 0% and 1 is 100%. So if we set it to the value, then the audio volume is going to be either a number from 0 to 1. But if we look inside of this mixer, it's actually 0 to -80, where -80 is the lowest number, and it'll mute the volume. This is because it's measured in decibels inside of Unity. So what we need to do instead is when our slider is at 0, this needs to relate to -80, and when it's at 1, it needs to relate to 0. So the way we can do that is take out this music slider, and we're going to start at -80. And we're just going to add it by 80 times the value. Now I'll copy that into these two and make sure that we change the name of this to our other exposed parameters. And then change this slider to SFX slider, and this one to voices slider. To change the text, I'm going to reference the music text and set the text equal to this. So I'm going to round the value to an integer and multiply it by times 100 to get the value in a percentage format, and then just add the percent to that right outside of there, and that'll update the text. There we go. So let's take this into Unity. So when we're here, we need to make sure that we add that class to one of our objects. I'm just going to add it to my pause menu. So I'll come down to the bottom here, take my audio mixer controller and add it in. And it's going to be expecting a master mixer. So I can just click on that and then choose the master mixer that's already been established by Unity. Inside here I want the music slider, which is this first one. Sound effects is the second, and voices is the third. And then their text, so that way I can just update that visual representation. So there we go, we have the values there. Now to actually call those functions when we move the slider up and down, we have to come to the slider class, and you'll have here a field called onValueChanged, and it may say it's already empty. By default it is. You can just come and click this plus sign and then reference an object that we want to call a function on. In my case it's the pause menu because that's where the audio mixer controller is. Click on new function, audio mixer controller, and then this is a list of all the public functions that are available. So anything you want to call in one of these events has to be made public. So I'll say set music volume, and that's going to update when I move that slider. So then I'll move into this one, grab that pause menu. This is for the sound effects, so I'll set the sound effects volume. And the last one for the voices, I'm going to do the same thing, but then reference the set voice volume. So that's going to move our values up and down, and just so we can see that, I'm going to go ahead and enter Unity and start it up. So once I enter my pause menu, if I start dragging these, you'll notice that the values change on these mixers. To have a sound Now to have a sound affected by these, we need to associate the output to these mixers. Every audio source is going to have that option. If I come to my audio source here on the pause menu and look at it, there's a field here called output, and they're always set to none by default. But if we click on that little circle, then we have the option to select any of these mixer groups. I'm going to set this one to the music because that's what it is. And now if I go back into Unity and pause, music is playing, you can see it going through the mixer, and I can just drag this. There we are, just like that. And I also noticed that my text wasn't right, and that's because I actually need to round this to an integer. So I had my parentheses starting a little too early there. I need to make sure to round the entire thing to an integer instead. Now there is something I want you to notice when we're doing this, because it's still not quite done yet. When we enter here and change the music volume, yes, it works, but listen to this. We're at 100%, and if I want to take it down to half volume, that means I have to go to -40 here. And if I do, that is very quiet. That is not half volume. That's because the way the decibels were working, it's not entirely how we would think it would work based off of these numbers. So instead of going by the slider value itself, because technically halfway would be about 85%, maybe 90 even. So instead of mapping that value to be put on the music mixer as the slider's value, we want to map it to an animation curve instead. That way we can control exactly how steep the fall off is depending on the range of this slider. So if we come back to the audio mixer controller, we can just take a public animation curve, volume curve, and when we come back into Unity, we're going to have a new field in here, a little animation curve. This opens up a graph, and if we just pick one of these items down here, then we can start editing it. It's going to default to 0 and 1 on this side. And then if you just double click, you can start placing points on the graph and edit it to form whatever shape will work best. We want to have a fall off something like this, just because of the way the decibels work. I found that a curve like this is very accurate for using in the volume control. So just like this, I'm going to apply that there, and now we need to make this affect our volume when we're applying it through the master mixer. So instead of just going straight through 80 plus the 80 times the value, we want to get the actual point in that graph based on the value here. In other words, I realize as I'm listening to myself say that, it doesn't exactly sound like it makes a lot of sense. But if we're at 1, then we want to find the point on that graph, which is also at 1. And that would happen to be along this timeline. If we go to 1, then the point is at 1. It's full. So if we were going halfway on the slider, then we would go to 0.5 and find the point in that graph, which is up here around 0.85, 85%. So if we do that, then we can map the value appropriately. And the way we'll do that is saying we want to put this in parentheses and reference our curve. So we'll say volume curve dot evaluate. So we're going to evaluate the curve at this point in time, and the time is going to be the value of our slider. So whatever the value of the slider is, that's where we'll be looking inside of that curve to get the appropriate volume. So I'm just going to copy this. There we go. And now let's try that again. Now we should have a little better volume control here. And that's much better already. Toy around with that and see what sounds best for you. Now that we're able to affect the volume, we need to be able to save it, so that way when we quit the application and load it again, the volume is still the same. So let's head back into our script and add a couple more functions here. The first of which is going to be to save the levels, or save the volumes. It's a better way of putting it. And then the other is going to be to load the volumes. So to save them, since these values aren't anything that's going to be profile specific, we don't have to save them according to what game file we're in. So we don't have to worry about files or anything to save these in. We can actually save these to player prefs, which is a pretty good, pretty fast way of saving different simple values and then reloading them fairly quickly and fairly easily, like one line saving and loading. It is not secure, so anything that you want to save in player pref should be something very simple, something that you don't care if it's edited, because these values can actually be found in the registry editor if you know where to look. So let's go ahead and add these to player prefs. The way we're going to do that is we simply say player prefs dot set float, because we're using a float here, and I'm going to use the same name that I used for the actual variable, which is just going to be music volume, and the value I'm going to save is going to be the music slider dot value. Just like that, that'll save it. One line. I'm going to do the same thing for SFX volume and make that the SFX slider, and the same thing for the voice volume and make that the voice slider. Now when it comes to loading them, the player pref isn't going to exist unless we've already saved it, so we need to make sure that it exists first before we try to load the value. And that is simple as well, so we'll just say if player prefs dot has key and search for the key name we want to use, which is music volume. Then we will say music slider dot value equals player prefs dot get float by that same name, music volume. And do the same thing for sound effects and voices, whatever other channels you may have. Just make sure you're using the same name that you used to save them. So I would advise copying and pasting just to be on the safe side. And then say SFX slider and voices slider. Now, a pretty decent and reliable way to save these volumes every time without having to have special functions for them is just make sure they save whenever we quit the game. And there's actually a function by Unity that's already available for us. If we just type in void and say on application quit, this is a function that's called every time the application stops. Every time you exit out of the application, every time you exit out of the player inside of the engine, this function is going to be called on whatever script it's attached to. So when this happens, I'm going to save the volumes. And in order to do the same thing on start, I'm just going to say private void start, and this will be to load the volumes. So now let's jump back into Unity and we can test all of this out for ourselves and check it out and see how it works. I've got my thing set to the music output here, so we should be able to hear the results easily. Go ahead and pause it, the music is playing, and I'm just going to take that down to 27% and exit out of the game, come back in, and you can already see that the value has been loaded back to -28. I'll just unpause or pause it. There you go. Music is playing, but it's at 27%, which is perfect. One thing I did here, my text for all of them is actually linked to the music volume. See that? And it's actually not saving that, so... Oh, well, it is. It just wasn't applying because I was using the same one. So for all of these, I have music text. They're all set to music text, but when I do the sound effects, I want to make sure that's sound effects text and voices text. And now when I come back in, there we go. Everything is loaded exactly the way it was when I stopped. So that's how you control volume inside of your visual novel. This is a very simple set, but you can see how easy it'll be to control all these different volumes, and you can add as many as you want because you can add as many mixers as you want. Just make sure to expose those parameters and make sure that your sliders are set to activate those functions that set the volume. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like and consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time.